World History Add Timeline. Toggle Navigation. Last updated October 29, 2022. Timeline of World History, A. D. All military World War II, World War II Pacific, World War II Europe, climate, disease, economics, exploration, literature, politics, religion, science, technology. First. Americas, China, Rome. Aug. 29 1943. Date A. D. Events and people. 180 Unfortunately, since the scholars designing the new calendar didn't have the concept of zero, the new Gregorian calendar is calculated to start at year 1, so we go directly from December 31st, 1 BC to January 1st, 180, thereby making all the easy calculations of date intervals off by 180. The population of Rome swells to 1 million people, a record it will keep for 1,800 years, until London reaches that number. 9 Battle of Teutoburg Forest. 20,000 Roman soldiers under the command of Publius Quintilius Varus in Germany are betrayed by their German allies while in a long convoy line through the Teutoburg Forest. Almost all legionnaires are killed. Many years later, Emperor Augustus, desperately needing those legions, went around the palace late at night muttering, "Varus, give me back my legions." 12 The supremacy of Latin is complete. The last known Etruscan inscription is carved. 30-33 Christianity is established as Jesus is crucified. 64 July 18th In a terrifying week, 2/3 of Rome burns to the ground and Emperor Nero takes the opportunity to rebuild Rome and claims a huge plot of land to build his new palace complex. Nero blames the fire on the Christians, although some claimed the fire was started by Nero to clear the land. He orders the first Roman persecution of the new faith. 79 Mount Vesuvius erupts and buries the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum in ash, preserving for modern scholars a window into ancient Roman life. 70 After a 6-month siege, the Romans under the direction of Titus destroyed Jerusalem, killing 1.5 million Jews. The gold taken from the temple finances the Colosseum back in Rome. 85-165 Claudius Ptolemy devises a framework of astronomy which will last for 1,400 years. He also calculates pi as 3 plus 8/60 plus 30/602, which in decimals is 3.1416666. An amazing feat for the time. 96-180 Rome has the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius and Marcus Aurelius. 97 Chinese General Pan Chao sends an embassy to the Roman Empire. 117 Emperor Trajan extends Rome's territories to the largest they will ever be. 122 Roman Emperor Hadrian begins the impressive 73-mile defensive wall in the north of England to keep out the Picts and tax the trade. 135 The Bar Kokhba revolt in Jerusalem against the Romans is finally crushed after 2.5 years, during which the Jewish state had home rule, and a resumption of animal sacrifices. 580,000 Jews are killed in the restoration of Roman rule, and the city of Jerusalem is reduced to rubble. Emperor Hadrian does not allow Jews to return to Jerusalem and renames the city Aelia Capitolina. The Jews will not have political control of Israel again for 1,813 years. 150 Greek mathematician Ptolemy, using polygons like Archimedes, estimates pi to be 3.1416, which is amazingly close to 3.1415926. 235 The Roman crisis of the 3rd century starts. The Eternal City will struggle with civil wars, plagues, barbarian invasion, and climate change. 250 Beginning of the Classic period for the Maya, who will rise to amazing feats of scientific knowledge and architecture. 269 Not content to be the ruler of the Pomerian Empire in Syria, the beautiful warrior Queen Zenobia breaks with Rome and invades Egypt. Emperor Aurelian eventually defeats her. Some records show she was killed after Aurelian's triumph, but others say she was pardoned, due to her beauty and regal bearing, and married a Roman senator, and lived peacefully in luxury the rest of her days. 271 Roman Emperor Aurelian starts building the walls around Rome, which would run for 12 miles and were 11 feet thick and 26 feet tall. This is a concrete statement that Rome could no longer hold its enemies back at the border. Other major towns started constructing their own walls against the raiding barbarians whose skills do not typically include siegecraft. 285 The crisis of the 3rd century comes to an end with the ascension of Diocletian to the throne. He reorganizes the administration of the empire. He also tries to set up a method of succession with Augustus's and Caesar's to end the civil wars, but it fails. 313 Edict of Milan is issued. Christians are now tolerated in the Roman Empire. 325 Constantine the Great wins the civil wars of the Tetrarchy and reunites the four regions of Diocletian's administration into a single empire again. 329 Saint Basil of Caesarea, Greek bishop of Caesarea Massica, modern-day Turkey, is born. He will care for the poor and establish what we would consider the first hospital. 325 May 11 Roman Emperor Constantine dedicates his new eastern capital Byzantium, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. Although the western capital, Rome, will fall in 476, the Eastern Roman Empire will survive another 1,000 years. 361 Emperor Julian, the apostate, tries to return the empire back to the pagan religions, but fails. 365 July 21 A devastating tsunami overwhelms Alexandria, Egypt, killing 5,000 people. Right before the wave hits, the water recedes from the coast as it is being sucked into the unseen approaching wave, beaching the trading ships in the harbor. Citizens quickly looted the overturned ships, but were in for the surprise of their lives when the water returned. 378 January 8 Mayan envoy Fire is born, enters the city of Huaca. He will consolidate the small Mayan city-states and launch the Mayan Golden Age that will endure for 5 centuries. 378 August 9 The Battle of Adrianople, Hadrianopolis, the beginning of the end of Roman military power. Not waiting for reinforcements, Emperor Valens gives the order to his weary men to attack the circled wagons of the Goths. In a surprise to all, the absent Gothic cavalry returns just as the battle is about to begin. The heavy cavalry routs the light horsemen of the Romans and is victorious over the Roman infantry. More. 383 Magnus Maximus is proclaimed emperor by his troops in York. He strips England of troops and money and takes them to the continent to try and become emperor of Rome, but fails after 5 years. Britain is left much poorer to defend itself against the coming onslaught of invaders. 394 The priest Esmeticone carves the last Egyptian hieroglyphs in the Temple of Philae in southern Egypt. The meaning of hieroglyphs will soon be forgotten for 1,300 years. The Demotic script for Egyptian and the Greek language will be used by the common people. 400 The first practical horse collar appears. Earlier versions choked the horse and limited their agricultural use. Horses quickly replaced some oxen since they are more efficient with feed. 400 The first autobiography in the Western world is written by Saint Augustine of Hippo when he completes the Confessions. He dies on August 28, 430 during the Vandal siege of his African home of Hippo, in modern-day Algeria. He wrote clearly about the absolute need of God's grace to a fallen humanity. 410 August 24, after being betrayed by Rome several times, Visigoths leader Alaric marches on Rome to demand the money promised to his troops. Emperor Honorius refuses to pay what is owed them, and the Visigoths sack Rome for 3 days. Alaric tells his troops to not kill unnecessarily and not to harm churches or religious statuary. 461 March 17 St. Patrick dies. He was kidnapped at the age of 16, and then enslaved in Ireland. He escaped back to his home, was ordained a bishop, and then went back to Ireland in 433 to bring Christianity to the Emerald Island. His autobiography is called the Confessio. 476 The Western Roman Empire falls. 496 King Clovis of the Franks converts to Orthodox Christianity. January 13, 532 Almost half of Constantinople is destroyed and tens of thousands of people killed in the Nika riots, which starts as a sports riot and grows into a full rebellion against Emperor Justinian. Initially Justinian wants to flee, but his wife Theodora shames him into staying and fighting for his position. He wins the civil war. 536 The coldest winter in 2,000 years haunts Europe. Summer does not come and the sun shines only faintly, perhaps due to ash from an Icelandic volcano. Famine stalks Europe and China as crops fail. Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian's dream of revitalizing the Eastern and Western Roman empires is dealt a severe blow, but the bad news is just starting. 541 The Justinian Plague. A disease kills 40% of Constantinople by 544 and 25% of Europe south of the Alps. By the 8th century this plague disappears mysteriously. It is suspected to be bubonic plague and will not to return to Europe until the 14th century. 550 The first windmills are used by the Persians to power irrigation pumps. 570 Muhammad born. Syria, Jerusalem, Egypt, Persia and then Africa fall to Muslim armies many decades later. 632 Muhammad dies. 635 Irish monk Aidan founds a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England. After the Roman Empire fell, England was invaded by Saxons and Christianity was replaced by the Nordic gods. Aidan tirelessly reintroduced Christianity back to England. 637 A vastly superior army of Iranian Sassanids is defeated by determined Arab Muslims in the Battle of Qadisiyah. 650 The beginning of the Mississippi and Cahokia culture in America, the most advanced of the Plains people. The Cahokia people will build the largest and mound structure in North America, Monk's Mound, and create an astronomical observatory now known as Woodhenge and trade from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. They decline in 1400, a century before the Europeans arrive. 637 As the Muslim advance overtakes his hometown of Tarsus, Byzantine Greek scholar Theodore flees to Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. There he studies astronomy, medicine, law, and Greek rhetoric and philosophy. He travels to Rome and learns Latin and literature. He is selected to be the Archbishop of Canterbury and brings the learning from the Roman Empire to England. He founds a school in Canterbury which teaches Greek and Latin. 657 to 680 The earliest poem written in English, Cadman's Hymn, is composed. 732 Battle of Tours, Charles Martel stops a Muslim army and the Muslim advance into Western Europe. 775 Saxon king Offa of Mercia introduces a coin named sterling. 240 sterlings make 1 pound of silver. This will be the future currency of the Bank of England. 793 Vikings start routinely raiding Ireland. 821 Torrential rains rot crops rot in the field, followed by terrible winters that freeze the rivers of northern Europe so completely that horse carts use the Rhine for a road. The following 3 years of no summers and horrible winters cause famine and disease. Some Norse believe that it is Fimbulwinter, the precursor to Ragnarok, the dreadful apocalyptic end of time and death of the gods. Scientists now believe the climate catastrophe was caused by the eruption of the Icelandic volcano Katla. 850 to 1315 The medieval warming period. Temperatures rise in Europe, and the climate is ideal for farming. The Vikings settle Greenland. English farmers grow grapes for wine. The population in Europe swells. 900s Fall of the Mayan classic culture. In one of the great mysterious of North America, the Mayan abandoned their amazing cities all over Mesoamerica. 904 Gunpowder is used as a weapon for the first time in the siege of Huacheng, China. Although the Chinese developed gunpowder by mixing 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur centuries earlier for fireworks, this is the first recorded time to be used in a large battle. 910 The first nailed iron horseshoe is documented. After extensive use, a horse would have to be rested so their hooves could heal. With the invention of the iron horseshoe, horses could now work full-time, a huge boost to agricultural productivity. 999 Gerbert 940-1003 becomes Pope Sylvester II and writes about Arabic numerals. Unfortunately, the new numbering system doesn't really take hold in Europe until the 14th century. From Paul Gans it should be noted that the Arabic numerals were neither invented by nor used by the Arabs. They were developed in India by the Hindus around 600 AD. Counting boards were being used with Roman numerals in U.S. colonial times. 1009 An army led by Caliph al-Hakim destroys the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. This desecration will be a rallying point for the Crusades to come. 1021 Norse settlers build a village in the New World in Newfoundland at Land's Ox Meadows and stay for a few years before returning to Greenland. It is thought they abandoned the New World due to conflicts with the native inhabitants. 1024 The Chinese issue the first paper money. 1040 In China, Baisheng uses ceramic pieces to create the first movable type printing system. 1066 Harold Godwinson wins the Battle of Stamford Bridge and a second battle at Fulford against the Viking invaders of England led by Harold Hardrada. Harold Godwinson then marches his weary army to Hastings to meet yet another invader, Duke William of Normandy. Harold Godwinson is defeated, and the period of Norman domination begins. William brought with him the French practice of building stone castles. Few stone castles had been in England before, but by only 1100 England had 84 castles. 1086 The Domesday Book is written for William the Conqueror to detail the wealth and property of England. 1095 Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade to protect the Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land from attack. 1099 The First Crusade captures Jerusalem using 15,000 troops and establishes 5 small Christian states. Oddly, 1,000 years earlier when Rome besieged Jerusalem, they fielded 60,000 soldiers. The Middle Ages battles were smaller in scope than antiquity. 1140 Angkor Wat, a huge temple complex, a really huge amazing complex, is built in Cambodia. 1144 Second Crusade is started by Bernard of Clairvaux after the Christian kingdom of Edessa falls to Muslims. 1144, June 11 The St. Denis Cathedral outside Paris is dedicated, marking the end of Romanesque and the beginning of Gothic architecture. It uses the pointed arch-ribbed vaults and the flying buttresses. These new innovations produce an awe-inspiring, light-filled space never before seen and launches a wave of cathedral building in Europe following the French style. 1149 Oxford University is founded in England. 1175 The Toltec civilization collapses in Mexico. 1187 Although invented probably in 880, the magnetic compass now becomes common for ocean-going ships in the Far East. 1200 In an amazing navigation feat, Tahitians sailed to Hawaii and enslaved the local inhabitants who had arrived around 800 years earlier. 1200 The Mayan culture revives after its collapse in 900 AD and survives until the 1450s when it falls shortly before the Europeans arrive. 1202 Leonardo Fibonacci publishes the Book of the Abacus and revolutionizes mathematics in Europe. 1206 Genghis Khan leads the Mongol armies. 30 to 60 million people are killed in their campaigns building the largest known land empire. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. 1204 On the way to the Holy Land for the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders are convinced by Enrico Dandalage, the Doge of Venice, to conquer Constantinople instead. 1215 June 15, England's King John puts his stamp on the Magna Carta, binding himself to obey the country's laws such as habeas corpus. No freeman shall be taken, imprisoned, or in any other way destroyed, except by the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to none will we deny or delay right or justice. 1218 Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, ruler of the Khwarezmiya Empire, kills all the members of a 500 camel caravan from Genghis Khan and steals all the goods, but the Shah did not know who he was dealing with. The empire strikes back and the Mongols utterly destroy his empire. For the Shah's greed and arrogance, 2.25 of his subjects die. 1223 Genghis Khan invades Russia. 1241 April 9 The Battle of Leni is fought between Prince Henry and the Mongols commanded by Batu Khan for control of Poland. The Mongols successfully defeat another European army. 1242 Florence, Italy mints the florin, the first gold coin in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. It is a sign that stability, trade, and wealth are returning to Europe. The florin would remain a popular coin for 5 centuries. 1250 European sailors now begin to use the magnetic compass. 1258 Mongol troops utterly destroy Baghdad, the capital of the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate. The Mongols destroyed so many books by throwing them into Tigris that its water was colored black from the ink. 1275 Marco Polo starts on his alleged trip to China. He returns in 1295 to Venice. 1281, August. After conquering most of Asia, Kublai Khan invades Japan with 4,400 ships and 140,000 soldiers, but a typhoon, a divine wind, kamikaze, destroys most of the fleet. 70,000 troops die in the storm, the worst naval disaster in history. 1,285 spectacles for the farsighted are invented in Italy. 1,300 eyeglasses are common in Rome for scholars. 1,300 After 1,500 years, the Anasazi of Arizona abandoned their cliff dwellings for unknown reasons. 1,300 Gunpowder is used for warfare in England after being introduced to Europe in 1242. 1309 to 1376 Pope Clement V moves the papacy to Avignon, France for almost 70 years, starting the Babylonian exile. 7 successive popes will reside there. This will complicate the 100 Years' War, since funds from the English Church are sent to the Pope, who was closely associated with the French state. 1315 to 1317 The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 Torrential rains and cool weather strike Europe. Perhaps the result from a volcano erupting on Mount Tarawera in New Zealand. The rains wash seeds from the fields. Whole villages are abandoned. Animal herds are devastated by disease. Millions die from starvation. The malnourishment of the children will make them vulnerable to the coming plague. In 1348, 1323 The Aztec tribe is forced to flee their homeland to a remote island in a lake because they sacrificed a young Colhua princess from the neighboring tribe to their god instead of marrying her to a prince. In their new island home they see an eagle perched on a cactus, which the Aztecs, or Mexica as they are called, take for a divine sign that this is their home. 1337 The 100 Years' War between England and France starts when the King of France invades Gascony, which is held by the English King Edward III, although under homage to the French king. Remember, William the Conqueror was from French Normandy, and still retained control of his French lands when he won the English crown in 1066. So English kings even 271 years later had large holdings in France until the end of this dreadful 116-year war. 1337 Timur Lang, Tamerlane, a Muslim conqueror of Mongol descent, is born. He conquers a huge territory in the Middle East and Asia. Some think his feats rival Alexander the Great. 17 million people die from his conquests. 1341, June 23 At the Battle of Bannockburn, the Scots defeat the English and regain their independence. Robert the Bruce becomes Robert I of Scotland. 1346, August 26 In the first major battle of the 100-Year War, the English under King Edward III are victorious against overwhelming odds. They kill 1,500 French troops at the Battle of Crécy using the new superweapon of the time, the Welsh longbow, while suffering less than 100 casualties themselves. Edward also deploys a few cannon which do little actual damage, but mostly scare the French with man-made thunder. 1346 The bubonic plague starts in China and moves westward, aided by the ease of travel in the Mongol Empire. The Mongols laid siege to the port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula and catapulted plague corpses into the besieged city. The Mongol army withdraws, but has succeeded in bringing the plague to Europe. 1348 The Black Plague, aka bubonic in Europe, kills about 75 million. Contemporary accounts place the death toll at 1/3 of inhabitants. Vast social changes result. Workers become a scarce commodity, increasing their bargaining power with employers. Farmland reverts back to forests as the number of farmers decrease. 1381, May 30 The English peasants' revolt begins with riots in Kent and Essex over tax increases to fund coastal defences. Wat Tyler will lead the rebels in a march to London, burning homes and property of those deemed wealthy. Foreigners, especially the Flemish, are murdered along the way. Although Tyler is eventually killed, and the movement crushed, the revolt hastens the decline of feudalism in England. 1384 Translating from the official Latin Vulgate, Oxford scholar John Wycliffe and his team produce the first English Bible. Since it predated the printing press, all copies were handwritten. 1408 September 16 Thorstein Olafsson and Sigridar Bjornsdottir are wed in the church of Hvalsey in Greenland. This is the last record of the Norse settlements founded in 986, which did well initially as the climate was warm and agreeable to crops, but as the climate turned colder, the Norse abandoned Greenland. 1414 After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, the knowledge of how to build with concrete was gradually lost. A chance discovery of a manuscript from Pollio Vitruvius reignites interest in concrete. 1415 Using the Welsh longbow, the English devastate the French at Agincourt as the Hundred Years' War drags on. 1431 Joan of Arc burned at the stake. She is credited with leading the French in victory over the English. The English had been dominating France since Agincourt. Joan of Arc was helped by artillery that could now damage castle walls of the English. 1436 Filippo Brunelleschi completes the dome on the Florence Cathedral, which today is still the largest brick dome in the world. His enormous accomplishment of creating a dome larger than the Pantheon in Rome put antiquity on notice that Renaissance Europe was here and could surpass the achievements of the ancient Romans, whose works had dwarfed Western Europe for 1,000 years. 1440 Van Eyck reveals the secret to his greatly improved oil paints that used linseed oil with piled glass, calcined bones, and mineral pigments, giving painters a wider palette. 1441 First documented black African slaves imported into Europe. 1453 The Roman Empire finally falls as Constantinople falls to the forces of Mahommed II. Mahommed II uses European artillery mercenaries to destroy the walls. This is the first use of a forward observer to direct artillery fire whose crews cannot see their targets. 1455 German inventor Johann Gutenberg revolutionizes knowledge transfer. He improves or invents 3 items: the printing press, movable metal type, and an oil-based ink. His first work is the 42-line Bible. Unscrupulous partners take over his business, and Johann ultimately dies in poverty. 1455 By mixing the ash of the Salsola soda and Salsola kali bushes into his glass, Venetian glassmaker Angelo Baravier removes impurities and creates Cristallo, a clear glass that will be crucial to scientific instruments and speed the birth of modern science. 1462 Ivan III finally overthrows the Mongol overlords and declares Russia the Third Rome, which is why the title Tsar sounds so much like Caesar. 1476 The Chamu civilization in Peru is defeated by the rising power of the Inca. The Chamu started around 1100. 1485, August 22 The Lancastrians are ascendant. In the Battle of Bosworth, Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian, defeats the Yorkish king, Richard III, starting the Tudor dynasty in England. 1485 The sweating sickness, a devastating illness, hits England. Henry VIII's older brother dies of the disease, paving the way for him to become king. Several outbreaks occur until 1551, when it mysteriously disappears. 1487 Aztec ruler Ahuitzotl sacrifices 20,000 prisoners to the Aztec war god Huitzilopochtli. 1489 Instead of using abbreviated words to indicate addition and subtraction, German mathematician Johann Widman starts the practice of using the symbols plus and minus. 1492, January 2 The armed forces of Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand V conquer Granada, the last Moorish fortress in Spain. The Reconquista is complete. 1492, October 12 Queen Isabella's advisors correctly state that China could be visited by going west since they know the earth is round, but that a ship would run out of supplies first since it was so far. Christopher Columbus uses some creative math and drastically underestimates the size of the earth. Fortunately for him, the Americas got in the way. He lands in the Bahamas. He dies in 1506, still thinking he had landed in Asia. 1494 Charles VIII invades Italy with new bronze cannons. The French break through in 8 hours the fortress walls of Monte San Giovanni, which had previously withstood a siege of 7 years. The arrival of the mobile cannon greatly reduces the value of fortresses and had wide political impact, mostly increasing the power of kings over their nobles, since nobles could no longer defy the king and hide behind their castle walls. 1494 Luca Pacioli, a Franciscan friar and friend of Leonardo da Vinci, writes a 600-page mathematics textbook Summa de Arithmetica Geometria Proportionia et Proportionalita, published in Venice in 1494, detailing mathematics, especially for the merchant, and formalizing double-entry bookkeeping. Although seen today as boring, it was revolutionary in its day and allowed Renaissance Europe to leap ahead in trade. 1498 May 20, Captain Vasco da Gama becomes the first European to travel to India by way of the sea. He arrives near the city of Calicut and receives a hostile welcome from the traders. Tensions run high, many people are killed. Spices are brought back to Portugal. The return on investment was an amazing 60 times the initial investment. Da Gama, who earns a reputation of being very cruel, returns later with 20 warships to enforce trade agreements. 1504, Feb. 29 Columbus is shipwrecked on Jamaica, with the locals being less inclined to provide food for his sailors. Columbus, after consulting his almanac, tells the Jamaicans that God is displeased with them, and he will blot out the moon in 3 days. The eclipse does occur, and the locals energetically resupply Columbus. 1513 Vasco Núñez de Balboa is the first European to see the Pacific Ocean. Jealous of his fame, members of the Spanish court convince the king that Balboa is guilty of treason. For his bravery, Balboa is beheaded in 1519. 1514 After studying in Italy, Nicholas Copernicus 1473–1543, returns to Poland convinced that the earth revolves around the sun. He dedicates his work to his friend Pope Paul III. 1517 October 31 An Augustinian monk, Martin Luther, nails his 95 theses to the church door in Wittenberg, unknowingly initiating the Protestant Revolution. 1521 Hernando Cortés conquers the Aztec Empire by allying himself with the other people who hated the Aztecs for some reason, their unsavory habit of using them for human sacrifices perhaps. 1521 May the Constable of France, Charles de Bourbon, attacks Rome. He is killed early by a crossbow dart, but his army sacks the treasures of ages from the Eternal City. 1522, September 6 Basque Captain Juan Sebastian Elcano and 17 of sailors complete the first circumnavigation of the globe that was started by Ferdinand Magellan 3 years and 1 month earlier. The feat will not be done again for 59 years. 1526 William Tyndale, scholar and speaker of 8 languages, publishes the first translation of the New Testament in English. For his efforts he is imprisoned for 500 days in horrible conditions and then strangled, and his body burned 10 years later. 1528 November 6 Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca becomes the first European to set foot in Texas. De Vaca is captured and enslaved by the Karankawa Indians, but escapes 2 years later. 1532 November Inca ruler Atahualpa meets Francisco Pizarro. Atahualpa wanted to impress the Spanish and the Inca by coming to the meeting with 4,000 unarmed men, showing that he was so powerful he needed no soldiers to protect the royal personage. The 150 Spanish slaughter the Incas and hold Atahualpa hostage. With 150 men, Pizarro conquers the Inca Empire of 6 million people. Moral to the story: don't trust strangers wanting gifts. 1536 John Calvin writes The Institutes of the Christian Religion. 1541 Francisco de Orellana is the first European to navigate down the length of the Amazon River, enduring many hardships. He had a gift for the local languages and communicated with the local peoples. He wrote about large populations living in villages continually lining parts of the river, villages and cultures that will vanish totally when the inhabitants are struck by new and terrible diseases. 1550 Greek, Latin and Hebrew scholar Robertus Stephanus publishes a Greek New Testament, the Textus Receptus, which will become the basis for many translations into common languages for centuries to come. This is the first Bible to have our familiar chapter and verse notations. 1550 to 1850 The Little Ice Age strikes Europe. After the medieval warming period when climate was ideal for raising grains in Europe, temperatures start to fall, and with them the fortunes of many in Europe. Crops fail and many starve and freeze to death. 1556 earthquake in China kills 830,000. 1557 The equal sign is first used by Welsh physician and mathematician Robert Recorde, who was tired of having to write is equal to and decided on parallel lines as the perfect symbol for equality. Adding to his credit, Recorde also popularized the plus sign to English. 1559, January 15 Elizabeth Tudor, after surviving many attempts on her life, is crowned Queen of England, ushering in the English Renaissance where England becomes a major world power. 1572 The Massacre of St. Bartholomew. Tens of thousands of Huguenots, French Protestants, are killed in France. 1564 April 23 William Shakespeare, titan of English literature, is born in Stratford-on-Avon in England. 1564 June 22 Fleeing religious persecution, French Huguenots establish Fort Caroline in Florida. 1567 Spanish explorer Juan Pardo establishes the earliest Spanish outpost in the interior of North Carolina, part of a series of 6 forts in Appalachia. The Spanish trade with the local Mississippian culture locals while looking for gold. The natives will attack all forts in 18 months, burn them to the ground and kill all but one of the Spaniards. September 1, 1575 The Spanish crown declares bankruptcy after squandering the unbelievable wealth from the New World. The inflow of precious metals into Spain causes inflation, makes foreign products cheaper, and wipes out local industries. All the gold of the Aztecs and the silver of the Incas, the accumulated wealth of centuries, are wasted in useless wars, bringing bloodshed and destruction to Europe. 1575 In Japan, 2 armies meet. The side with guns wins for the first time, yet by mutual agreement, guns are outlawed 100 years later. 1580, September 26, Sir Francis Drake returns to England in the Golden Hind, becoming only the second ship to circumnavigate the Earth in a single voyage. 1585 Thomas Harriot first writes about an amazing herbal remedy introduced to him by the local peoples of America called tobacco. 1582, October 4 To correct for the drifting of the equinox from March 21, Pope Gregory XIII decrees that the next day would be October 15. Not all countries obey his edict, and many disputes arise over interest to be paid and wages. 1569 Gerard du Mercator publishes his cylindrical projection of the Earth. 1588, May 19 Philip II's invincible Spanish armada of 130 ships embark for England, but are delayed by bad weather, giving the English more time to prepare. The outnumbered English navy win a decisive victory and destroy half the armada. March 20, 1602 United East India Company, Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, or the VOC founded. This is the first multinational joint stock company, a landmark in economic development. The VOC prospered for centuries, but went bankrupt at the end of the 18th, some say due to corruption and poor management. 1603, February 7 Battle at Glenfruin when the MacGregors slaughtered the Colquhouns, my ancestors. 1607, May 14 The English settle in Jamestown. 1608 The city of Santa Fe, New Mexico, the oldest capital city in the U.S., is founded by the Spanish. Santa Fe prospers for 300 years before New Mexico becomes a state, well, except for the time 1680 to 1692 when the Pueblo people revolt and push the Spanish out of their territory. 1608 The first telescope is invented by German-Dutch spectacle maker Hans Lippershey. It can magnify its subject 3 times. He tries to patent his new telescope in the Netherlands on this date. 1610 January 7 Using his improved telescope, Galileo discovers Jupiter's 4 moons. This earth-shaking observation shows that just as Jupiter's moon orbit their planet, our planet could orbit the Sun. 1612 Galileo Galilei proposes for the first time in history that the Sun rotates on its axis after charting the locations of sunspots over time. 1613 June 29 Shakespeare's Globe Theatre burns down. The theater could seat 1,000 people in the galleries and another 2,000 could stand on the grounds. 1617, April 4, John Napier, inventor of logarithms. 1614, and Napier's bones, ivory sticks which foreshadowed the slide rule, dies in Edinburgh. 1619, Johann Kepler finally solves the mystery of the motion of the planet, showing the orbit of planets are elliptical. The early Greeks thought the study of the heavens was the highest calling of mankind, and Johann discovered the plan. His third law of planetary motion states, the squares of the planets' orbital periods are proportional to the cubes of the semi-major axes of their orbits. 1620, Pilgrims arrive at Plymouth. 1628, the mystery of the circulatory system is finally solved when English Dr. William Harvey publishes Exercitatio Anatomica de Motu Cordis et Sanguinis in Animalibus, showing the heart pumps blood to the lungs and then to the rest of the body. 1642, August 22, the first of three English civil wars start with Charles I and his cavaliers fighting against Parliament and the Roundheads. 1645, June 14, in the Battle of Naseby, the Parliamentarian New Model Army soundly defeats the forces loyal to King Charles I of England, effectively bringing an end to the First English Civil War. 1648, 1/4 of Polish Jews are massacred, many survivors moved to Jerusalem. 1656, Christian Huygens, inspired by Galileo's observations about pendulums having a constant swing rate, invents the first working pendulum clock. Pendulum clocks will be the most accurate timepieces for 270 years. The increase in accuracy will accelerate scientific research. 1665, English scientist Isaac Newton uses an entirely new method to calculate pi by using an infinite series and calculus to quickly get to 15 digits. What had taken decades to calculate with Archimedes' polygon method could now be done in a fraction of the time. 1666, September 2, the Great Fire of London ravages the city for 3 days, destroying 80% of the buildings, leaving thousands homeless and bankrupt. Afterwards, London is remade when Sir Christopher Wren decrees new buildings will be made of brick and the streets to be widened. Oddly, the fire slows the progress of the plague by destroying so many rats. Only 16 people lost their lives in the inferno. 1668, Isaac Newton invents the first reflector type of telescope that uses mirrors instead of lenses. 1685, the Edict of Nantes revoked by Louis XIV in France. Many Huguenots are killed and many, like my ancestors, flee France. 1653, December 16, Oliver Cromwell becomes Lord Protector of England, Scotland and Ireland. 1676, October 9, Antony van Leeuwenhoek invents the first microscope. He is the first human to see bacteria, or as he called them, animalcules. He sees a whole world of life in a drop of water, laying open the undiscovered universe of the small. This lays the foundation of our modern view of disease. This is an underappreciated revolution in science brought about by better instrumentation. 1683, September 11, the King of Poland Jan III Sobieski, leading 20,000 horsemen, the largest cavalry charge in history, rides down from the hills around Vienna and routs the besieging Ottoman forces led by Vizier Mirzafonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha. The Battle of Vienna is the high-water mark of the Ottoman Empire. The date of the 9/11 attacks is got to avenge this battle. 1686, Isaac Newton writes Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which shows the laws of the heavens are the same as the laws of earth. 1689, February 13, William of Orange and Mary are crowned King and Queen of Britain in the bloodless Glorious Revolution, after accepting a Bill of Rights which limited royal authority and enlarged constitutional law. 1707, October 4, British warships led by Admiral Shovel run aground on the Scilly Islands off the English coast, killing 2,000 sailors. This intensifies the search for a solution to the longitude problem, eventually solved by John Harrison with an accurate clock. 1714, German physicist Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit, who had a flair for glass blowing, invents the mercury thermometer. His eponymous scale sets 0 degrees to be the lowest temperature he could make in his lab, a mixture of salt and ice. The thermometer is a huge boon to science because gas and chemical experiments involving temperature could now be measured precisely. 1712 Thomas Newcomen creates the first successful steam engine used to evacuate water from mines. 1714 Jethro Tull perfects the seed drill, which produces 8 times more wheat from the sown seed. For his efforts, he is vilified. 1722 The smooth-bore flintlock musket known as the Brown Bess is first used by the British. Amazingly, firearm technology stagnates and this gun is used for 116 years until replaced by a smooth-bore musket with percussion cap. 1722, April 5 Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen becomes the first European to discover Easter Island, aka Rapa Nui, the most remote inhabited island in the world with 2,000 to 3,000 natives whose Polynesian ancestors arrived at the island around 800 years earlier. 1735 The wise Carolus Linnaeus, a Homo sapien, creates a taxonomic system for naming species. 1735 Leonhard Euler solves the Basel problem, or what is the exact sum of the squares of the reciprocals of the natural numbers, i.e. 1 plus 1/4 plus 1/9 plus 1/16 plus. By the way, in case you have forgotten, the answer is pi 2/6. 1746, April 16 The last land battle fought in England is fought by the supporters of the House of Stuart, Charles Edward Stuart, aka Bonnie Prince Charlie, against the forces of the House of Hanover under the command of the Duke of Cumberland in the Battle of Culloden. Prince Charles' 4,000 mostly Scottish Highlanders, being hungry, poorly armed and badly led, lose 1,000 men compared to the 50 casualties in the English army. A purge of Highland culture follows. 1750 The Kentucky long rifle, which has groves or rifling cut into its barrel to give the bullet spin for stability, is common in the Appalachian Mountains, being brought to the U.S. by German gunsmiths. It has a 300-yard range instead of the 100-yard range of the smooth-bore muskets of the day, but it takes 60 seconds to reload instead of the 20 seconds for smooth-bore muskets. 1752 England adopts the Gregorian calendar and moves New Year's Day from late March to January 1st. Before this, September was the 7th month, October was the 8th month, which makes sense, now the names are off by 2. 1754 Scottish chemist Joseph Black discovers carbon dioxide, and later the latent heat of fusion. 1756 Scottish physician William Cullen gives the first documented public demonstration of artificial refrigeration. Using a pump to create a partial vacuum in a container of diethyl ether, he creates artificial ice for the first time in human history. 1759 January 1st After careful, measured experiments on models, John Smeaton publishes a paper showing that overshot water wheels are twice as efficient as undershot water wheels, disproving a French philosopher 50 years earlier who said undershot water wheels were more efficient. As England switched to Smeaton's recommendations, more power was available to the Industrial Revolution. Smeaton is remembered for his methodology of combining mathematics and carefully measured experiments to discover the fundamental laws of engineering. He is considered the father of civil engineering. 1763, February 10, the French and Indian War ends with the Treaty of Paris. Britain gains all of North American east of the Mississippi, saw New Orleans, important parts of India, and various islands from the French. Many American colonists, most notably George Washington, gained military experience in the conflict. 1768 December 10 As part of the Scottish Enlightenment, Scottish scholars published the initial part of the first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica in Edinburgh. It is the oldest continuously published and revised work in the English language. 1769 January 5 English patent 913 is granted to James Watt for his steam engine, which had many improvements, the most important being a separate condenser from the main piston. Since this engine was 5 times more efficient than Newcomen's, it was practical for many new uses, ushering in our modern age by powering the Industrial Revolution. 1775 April 19 At 5 a.m. 700 British troops march into Lexington to capture rebel leaders and weapons. They are met by 77 armed Minutemen waiting on the town's common green. After being ordered to disperse, the colonists start to leave the green, but then a shot heard around the world was fired by an unknown gunman, and the American Revolution is ignited. 1776 The American colonies declare themselves independent of Great Britain. 1776, September 6 David Bushnell navigates his primitive submarine, the Turtle, toward a British ship. His attempt at sinking the ship fails, but scares the blockading British ship away. 1777, September 7 The British sharpshooter Major Patrick Ferguson has an American officer in his sights, but does not fire, since it would be unprofessional to kill an unsuspecting officer. The officer is later revealed to be George Washington. 1778, January 18 After visiting Australia, James Cook is the first European to travel to Hawaii. 1781, March 13 William Herschel discovers Uranus using a telescope, the first planet found in modern times. 1781, October 19 General Cornwallis surrenders to the colonists in American while the band plays The World Turned Upside Down. 25,000 Americans died in the war. 1783 November 21 First manned hot air balloon flight in Paris by Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier and Marquis d'Arlanz. 1784 Englishman Henry Shrapnel invents a hollow cannon ball filled with metal particles which explodes above enemy troops with horrific effect. We see these in the Star-Spangled Banner line and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air. 1786 Sir William Jones, Chief Justice of India, proposes that Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and many European languages were all descended from a common Proto-Indo-European language. 1789, July 14 The French Revolution ignites with the storming of the Bastille to gain badly needed gunpowder. 1791, November 4 Miami Chief Little Turtle inflicts the worst defeat by Native Americans on the U.S. Army under the command of Arthur St. Clair, 9th President of the Continental Congress in the Battle of Wabash. 600 soldiers are killed, 1/4 of the U.S. Army. 1795 The metric system of measurement is introduced into France. 1793 John Smeaton, the father of civil engineering, lays the foundation for the modern age of concrete building by completing the innovative Eddystone Lighthouse in England. He solidifies the modern use of concrete, which had largely been forgotten since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. 1793 August 1 A yellow fever epidemic breaks out as French refugees from the Haitian Revolution flee to Philadelphia and bring the dreaded disease with them. Philadelphia, with 50,000 residents, is the largest city in the U.S. and the federal capital. 10% will die from the disease, making it one of the worst epidemics in the history of the country. Stephen Girard, the wealthiest man in America, personally nurses the sick back to health. 1794, June 2 The French Aerostatic Corps uses a balloon to observe an enemy bombardment at Fleurus, becoming the first use of military aerial reconnaissance in the West. The observers in the balloon would send messages about enemy deployments to the ground via semaphores and dropped messages. 1796, May 14 After noticing that milkmaids who had contracted cowpox never suffered the horrors of smallpox, English physician Edward Jenner infects a boy with cowpox and later infects him with smallpox. The boy never develops smallpox. Countless lives are saved through his simple observation. 1798 Thomas Malthus publishes an essay on the principle of population, claiming starvation was inevitable for the human race. Oddly enough, 220 years later the world is better fed than ever. 1798 June 18 Napoleon Bonaparte conquers Malta and outlaws slavery. 1799, July While scavenging for large rocks to build a wall near the town of Rosetta, a French soldier, Pierre-François Bouchard, discovers a curious large stone with 3 types of writing scripts. It will take 24 more years of scholarship before Jean-François Champollion, building on the work of Thomas Young, will decipher hieroglyphs. Champollion will read for the first time in over 1,000 years the history of ancient Egypt. 1801 Joseph Marie Jacquard invents a loom that uses punch cards to create designs in fabric. Workers, fearful for their jobs, threw their sabots, or shoes, into the machines to destroy them, giving rise to our word sabotage. 1801 December 24 English inventor Richard Trevithick improves on James Watt's steam engine and drives a steam-powered wagon uphill in Camborne, Cornwall, England. Many claim he is the father of the steam locomotive. 1803 English chemist John Dalton proposes the billiard ball model of the atom. It states that all matter is composed of tiny balls called atoms that cannot be created or destroyed, and that atoms of one element cannot be converted to atoms of another element. 1804, February 21 The first modern steam locomotive built by Richard Trevithick makes its maiden voyage pulling 5 carriages, 10 tons of iron, and 70 passengers. The train will revolutionize transportation and the modern world. Trevithick's marvel is not recognized at the time as something significant, and he will die alone and penniless. 1804 Napoleon is crowned Emperor of France. 1804 Henry Shrapnel's new artillery shell is used for the first time. The shell had a variable timer that could be set to explode and rain down lead shot on the enemy, making it a deadly anti-personnel weapon. The British will use the new weapon at the Battle of Waterloo to great effect. 1805, October 21 In the Battle of Trafalgar, the British fleet, under the command of Horatio Nelson, defeats a combined Spanish-French fleet. 1805, April 27 William Eaton leads the first American overseas military action on land. Against enormous odds, the Marines and mercenaries take the city of Derna, Tripoli, to prevent the Barbary pirates from stealing cargo and enslaving American citizens. 1807 Rev. Alexander John Forsyth of Scotland is getting tired of the birds he hunts, seeing the flash of fire in his powder pan of his flintlock shotgun and escaping before the gun actually fires. Taking advantage of the recently discovered fulminates that explode upon impact, he invents the percussion cap. Now the birds have no early warning. 1808 Importing slaves into the United States is outlawed. 1809 Napoleon Bonaparte awards Nicolas Appert the 12,000 franc prize for preserving food in bottles. Napoleon now had a way to easily supply his troops with food. Appert is known as the father of canning. He put food in jars and heating them for as long as he got necessary. The process was killing bacteria, although Louis Pasteur would not discover why Appert method worked for 100 years. 1812, September 17 The Battle of Borodino pitched Napoleon against the Russian army in the bloodiest day of the Grande Army's invasion of Russia. The French barely won, but did not pursue the disorganized Russians. 1812, June 24 Napoleon takes Moscow, but it's a hollow victory. The city is burned to the ground and the Tsar does not surrender. Napoleon, and what is left of the Grand Army, retreat. Of the original 600,000 soldiers, only 100,000 returned. 1814 During the War of 1812, the British under the command of General Robert Ross attack Washington, D.C. and in response to U.S. forces burning Canadian buildings against the rules of war, burned the White House, but not before enjoying a lovely dinner prepared by Dolly Madison before she fled. 1815 June 18 Napoleon defeated at Waterloo. 1816 The year without a summer. Mount Tambora erupts and throws so much dust in the air that it causes 10 inches of snow to fall in June in New England, U.S. Crops fail and famine is common. Many blame Benjamin Franklin and his experiments with electricity for the freak weather. Mary Shelley is forced inside and writes Frankenstein. 1822, February 17 The U.S. Senate passes the Missouri Compromise, admitting Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state in a futile attempt to ease tensions with slave proponents and abolitionists. 1822 Jacob Grimm of Grimm Fairy Tales fame proposes Grimm's Law, that many consonants have shifted in a consistent way from non-Germanic languages, like Latin and Greek, to Germanic languages, like English. For example, P's become F's, as in Latin pater becoming English father, Latin Pisces becomes English fish. 1824 Mexico's new constitution abolishes slavery. The first public railroad in the United States, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad B&O, opens with 23 miles of track using an American-built steam locomotive Tom Thumb built by Peter Cooper. 1831, August 21, Nat Turner leads a long-feared slave revolt in Virginia, killing 60 whites. The revolt is quickly stopped by the local militia, but many innocent slaves are hanged and life made even more miserable for slaves by harsh new actions to prevent future revolts. 1833 Charles Babbage designs the difference machine, a forerunner of the modern computer. Traditionally it was got to fail because metallurgy was not yet advanced enough. Recent views blame his machinist for wasting the money and being lazy. 1834 August 1 With the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 coming into force, England outlaws slavery and frees 780,993 slaves in most of its possessions and takes £20 million to compensation the owners. 1835 In a radical departure of the accepted norm, Belgian mathematician and astronomer Adolphe Quetelet promotes using the statistical concept of average for use in other sciences besides astronomy. This is a turning point in social sciences. 1836, February 25 Samuel Colt is awarded a U.S. patent for the first practical repeating revolver whose cylinders must be individually loaded with powder, wadding and lead projectile. His firearms allow the settling of the American West for the first time, giving pioneers a technical advantage over the Native Americans. Colt is the first to make firearms using an assembly line with interchangeable parts. He dies one of the richest men in America. 1836, March 6 Mexican forces under the command of Antonio López de Santa Anna overwhelmed the rebellious Texans inside the Alamo in a battle that lasts but 90 minutes. 1836 Slavery, which had been outlawed in Mexico, is reintroduced into Texas with the birth of the Republic of Texas. 1837 An over-investment in canals and railroads built with bonds from Europeans results in projects that cannot pay their bondholders. Many states in the U.S. start to default on bonds owed to Europeans. This starts the financial panic of 1837, and America slips into its first Great Depression. 1838 January 24 Samuel Morse demonstrates the telegraph in public. 1838, October 5 Killa Massacre. An outpost of settlers in East Texas is attacked by renegade Cherokee, Caddo, Coushatta Mexicans and several runaway slaves. 18 people are killed or kidnapped. This leads to an outrage of white settlers and many of the Cherokee are forced to leave Texas. 1840 March 28 The ironclad gunboat the Nemesis, built by a Scottish shipbuilder John Laird, leaves England bound for China, becoming the first ironclad to round the Cape of Good Hope. In China, she destroys 9 war junks, 5 forts, 2 military stations and a shore battery in a single day. The technological gap in warfare is widening between Europe and the rest of the world. 1844, May 24 Samuel Morse telegraphs what hath God wrought. From Washington to Baltimore, starting the age of the telegraph. Many people thought the telegraph would help end wars, since opposing sides could talk out their differences. Weather forecasting would become feasible as temperatures could be telegraphed from far away and cold fronts could be timed and predicted. 1844, June 8 Texas Ranger Captain John Coffee Hayes and 14 Rangers encounter a much larger band of Comanche warriors under the command of Yellow Wolf at Walker's Creek in Texas. For the first time the Rangers use the new Colt Patterson 5-shot revolver in battle, and the results are stunning. 1 Ranger is killed, but 20 to 50 Comanches become casualties. This encounter marks the turning of the war in the plains. For centuries the Comanches were better armed since they could loose 6 arrows in the time it took to reload a single-shot rifle. Now with the Colt revolver, the Comanche weapons dominance is over. 1845 to 1848 The Great Hunger, aka Potato Famine. Blight causes potato crop to fail in Ireland. 1.5 million die of starvation and disease. Ireland still exports grain to England to pay rents. Help from England was too little too late. 1848 Uncoordinated revolutions take place all over Europe in the revolts of 1848 when people demand more representation in their governments. Most will eventually fail, but some reforms come from the turmoil. 1847, September 14, United States troops enter Mexico City under the command of General Winfield Scott, ending the Mexican-American War. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in February, giving the United States California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Wyoming. The war was a dress rehearsal for the American Civil War. 1847 Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian doctor noticing the high incidence of childhood fevers, suggests that after doing autopsies physicians should wash their hands before delivering babies. He said that the disease is transmitted by some cadaveric material, instead of an imbalance of humors. He is ridiculed by the other doctors and eventually fired. 1848, February 26, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels publish a little pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto. 1849 The Smithsonian Institution supplies weather instruments to telegraph operators who report back weather information. The institution uses these readings to create the first real weather tracking and prediction system in the U.S. 1849 Drive. John Snow, through careful investigation, traces the 1849 cholera outbreak in Soho to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street, earning the title of Father of Modern Epidemiology. The pump was disabled, and the cholera outbreak subsided. The authorities never accepted his explanation, and after the outbreak, they replaced the Broad Street pump that was 3 feet from a cesspit. 1850 Le Napoleon, the first steam-powered warship with screws for propulsion, is built. 1850 July 14 Scottish physician John Gorrie debuts a mechanical ice-making machine at a Bastille Day party to rave reviews. The New England ice shipping establishment ridicule his artificial ice as unhealthy to protect their business. John Gorrie dies 5 years later penniless. Another 10 years will pass before artificial ice becomes available. 1850, September The Compromise of 1850 enacted, which temporarily mitigated slavery issues in the U.S. Territory above 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude are free states. Texas loses the sliver of land going into Colorado since its northern border is now capped at 36 degrees 30 minutes. 1850 The Taiping Rebellion in China gains steam. Eventually 20 to 30 million people will die, making this the most costly civil war in human history. 1854, July 8 Admiral Perry visits Japan with his black ships and forces Japan to trade with the U.S. Japan had been in virtual isolation for 200 years, and had no defense against the cannons of Perry's fleet. This ends 700 years of shogun rule. The emperor is brought back in 1868 in the Meiji Restoration. This initiated a rapid industrialization in Japan, resulting in a world-class navy which will defeat the Russians in 1904. 1854 Being distressed that so many British sailors were being lost in storms, Admiral Robert Fitzroy uses the new telegraph system to gather weather information for England and make forecasts. He is criticized for wasting government funds on what everyone knew was an impossible task. After saving many sailors' lives, he later takes his own life. 1854 The Clipper ship Flying Cloud sets the world sailing record for the fastest trip between New York and San Francisco, 89 days 8 hours. This record stood for over 130 years, until 1989. Clipper ships were narrow and long with huge amounts of sail, but passed out of fashion when steamships became reliable. 1854 October 25 During the Crimean War, Lord Cardigan led the British cavalry against the Russians in what would become known as the Charge of the Light Brigade. 1854, November 4 Florence Nightingale arrives in Turkey to care for the wounded from the Crimean War. She is initially rejected by the military brass, but later welcomed when their hospital is overwhelmed with wounded soldiers. She is instrumental in defining our modern profession of nursing. More. 1856 Louis Pasteur shows that disease is spread from tiny, little organisms instead of bad vapors. Germ theory is born. 1857, March 6 The U.S. Supreme Court rules in the Dred Scott case that a slave can be taken to free territory and the ownership of slaves overrules the laws of the local territory. 1859 After holding sway for 2 millennium, Aristotle's theory of spontaneous generation is finally put to bed by Louis Pasteur's swan neck flask experiment showing that particles from the air seed the growth of molds and flasks of broth. 1859 Charles Darwin publishes Origin of Species. 1859, August 27 George Bissell sees prices for whale oil skyrocketing as the spermaceti whales are overhunted and gambles on hiring Edwin Drake to drill an oil well in Titusville, PA. Progress is very slow, and Bissell mails Drake to shut down the well. Fortunately, the letter arrives late. Edwin Drake had just completed the first oil well in America the day before. Whale oil was selling for $5 a gallon, and kerosene from crude oil soon sold for 10 to 25 cents a gallon. 1859, September 1. While looking at sunspots, Richard Carrington, a widely respected solar astronomer, witnesses enormous solar flares which make the northern lights visible in the tropics and damages electric equipment all over the world. Telegraph equipment still can transmit messages without batteries due to the induced currents from the Carrington event. If a coronal mass ejection (CME), like the 1859 occurred today, electric power would be severely damaged and repairs might take months. 1860 James Clerk Maxwell completes his 4 equations of electromagnetism. 1860 Herman Hollerith invents an electronic tabulator for the U.S. Census. He starts a company that eventually becomes IBM. 1860 July Based on the Le Napoleon design, the ironclad French warship La Gloire is commissioned with 4.7-inch iron plates to protect her sides. A single screw and 3 masts provide power. The British quickly counter with the larger ironclad HMS Warrior. France does not have the industrial base to produce many of these ships, and the British soon take the lead in an expensive arms race. 1861 Scotsman James Clerk Maxwell proposes a method to make permanent color photographs. Thomas Sutton uses this technique to make the first color photograph of a tartan ribbon. 1861 April 12, at 4:30 a.m. Southerner Lt. Henry S. Farley fires a 10-inch mortar round into Union-held fortress of Ft. Sumter in Charleston Bay, starting the American Civil War, in which 400,000 Union soldiers and 200,000 Southern soldiers will be casualties, making it by far the most deadly conflict in American history. 1862, March 8 The ironclad CSS Virginia destroys 2 Union ships, sweeping away hundreds of years of military ship design. The days of the wooden warship in the New World ends today. 1862, May 4 The scout in the Civil War became the first person to be killed by a pressure-activated landmine. This novel instrument of war was developed by Southerner Gabriel J. Rains. The South buries mines in the road to slow down advancing Northern troops, until the North starts using Southern prisoners to walk ahead of their columns. Landmines will cause 1/3 of the American injuries in Vietnam War. 1863, January 1, President Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves in rebelling states. This makes British intervention on behalf of the Confederacy less likely due to the strong anti-slavery sentiments there. 1863, May 22, 10 a.m. For the first time in history, a military assault starts with synchronized watches in the battle for Vicksburg in the American Civil War. 1864, February 17, the Confederate H.L. Hunley becomes the first submarine to sink an enemy ship, the Union Housatonic. The Hunley itself sinks shortly afterwards, killing all 9 men on board. 1864, April 19, the CSS Albemarle, a Confederate ironclad designed by a 19-year-old and built in a cornfield from scrap iron, sinks a Union ship and wins the Battle of Plymouth for the South. 1865, April 9, at Appomattox, Virginia, Confederate General Robert E. Lee in full dress uniform surrenders his Army of Northern Virginia to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, who was wearing a muddy field uniform, almost ending the American Civil War. The Southerners, after swearing not to take up arms against the United States, are generously allowed to return to their homes with their horses to start spring planting. 1865, April 26, the U.S. suffers its worst maritime disaster when the overcrowded steamboat Sultana, full of ex-POW Union soldiers who had survived 4 years of war and brutal captivity, has a boiler explosion, and 1,800 people die in the chilly Mississippi. 200 more people die on the Sultana than the Titanic. 1865, May 13, Private John Williams becomes the last soldier killed in the Civil War at the Battle of Palmito Ranch in Texas, a Confederate victory. 1865, June 2, the American Civil War finally ends when Confederate General Edmund Smith, commander of all forces west of the Mississippi, surrenders the last Confederate army in the field. 400,000 Union soldiers and 200,000 Confederate soldiers are killed in the conflict. 1865, Augustinian monk Gregor Mendel sows the seeds of modern genetics. 1866, after his brother Emil is killed preparing nitroglycerin, Alfred Nobel stabilizes the notoriously temperamental explosive by mixing it with diatomaceous earth, creating the stable explosive dynamite. Alfred goes on to fund international prizes from his dynamite fortune. 1866, July 3, the Battle of Königgrätz is fought. Prussia had smartly sent observers to the American Civil War and learned of railroads, telegraphs, and new firearms. The Prussians used this newfound knowledge in the Austro-Prussian War. They overwhelmed the Austrians using their new needle guns, which used a cartridge instead of muzzle loading, and could be reloaded in a prone positions instead of standing like the French soldiers did. With telegraphs, the Prussians stayed in constant contact with the armies in the field, and the railroads brought fresh troops quickly to battle areas. 1866, North America and Europe are connected by a 2,500-mile-long telegraph cable. 1866, Robert Whitehead creates the first self-propelled torpedo. It runs on 3-cylinder engine using compressed air. This invention will be crucial for submarines to be offensive weapons. Whole new classes of boats will be built to launch these new weapons. The torpedoes in World War II will be expensive, about a third the cost of a tank. 1868, January 3, the feudal leaders of Japan are swept aside by the young Emperor Meiji, who centralizes and reforms the government. He embarks on a process of industrializing the economy and modernizing the army and navy. 1867, August 2, using their new .50 caliber Springfield breech-loading rifles, 26 soldiers from Fort Kearny, Wyoming fend off 1,500 Lakota Indians led by Red Cloud in the wagon box fight. The Lakota attacked in waves. The second wave expected to kill the reloading soldiers, but instead were greeted by a round of bullets from the new repeating rifles. 3 soldiers and approximately 50 Indians were killed. 1872, March 1, Yellowstone, the world's first national park, is created in the western U.S. 1873, the Colt Firearms Company debuts the revolutionary Colt single-action army revolver, or Peacemaker, which employs metal cartridges. 1876 to 1878, between 30 and 60 million people die in the Great Famine as the rains fail in India, China, and many other countries. 1876, March 10, Scotsman Alexander Graham Bell speaks into his new invention, Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you, and the world is never the same. He submits the patent for the telephone just hours ahead of his rival Elisha Gray. His patent may be the most valuable patent ever filed. 1876, Michelson and Morley fail to verify the existence of the ether, implying space is just empty space. 1876, June 25 to 26, that the Battle of Little Big Horn, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Crow Indians defeat General George Custer's troops. Many have speculated that if Custer had not split his troops and kept the cannon, he could have won easily. 25% of the Indians are estimated to have had superior weapons than the U.S. cavalry. The Indians had Spencer's Winchesters and Henry repeating rifles. Custer's men were armed primarily with the Springfield single-shot rifles. 1877, August 12, Thomas Edison invents the amazing phonograph to record voice and music. Many mediocre club singers and musicians will lose their jobs as clubs settle for a phonograph instead of live music. 1879, December 31, Thomas Edison demonstrates his incandescent light bulb. 1882, September 30, world's first hydroelectric dam is built in Appleton, Wisconsin. 1883, August 26, the island volcano of Krakatoa in Indonesia brilliantly explodes, killing 36,000 people. The tide is influenced in England and fine volcanic dust settles in New York. The sound of the explosion is heard 3,000 miles away. 1883 November 18, exactly at noon all the railroads in North America started using 4 standard time zones. Before this each city had its own solar time, leading to massive confusion in train schedules and accidents. In 1918 the U.S. Congress officially adopts the 4 time zones. 1884 Paul Weil revolutionizes firearms by inventing smokeless gunpowder, which is 3 times more powerful than current gunpowder. The higher velocity of bullets allows for longer distances and more accuracy since the trajectory is flatter. With less smoke, snipers can fire without giving away their location. Being more powerful, bullets can be smaller. Smokeless gunpowder is first used in the Lebel rifle by the French 2 years later. 1886 Heinrich Hertz discovers radio waves and declares them of no use whatsoever. 1885 July 6 9-year-old Joseph Meister, a victim of a rabid dog bite, is given a miraculous new vaccine by Louis Pasteur. The boy recovers and the scourge of rabies, which had previously been a death sentence, finally has a cure. The grateful Joseph works later as the caretaker of Pasteur's tomb. November 1, 1893 In the opening battle of the First Matabele War in then Rhodesia, British troops used the Maxim machine gun for the first time in battle to devastating effect. The machine gun accelerates the colonization of Africa. In one later battle 50 British soldiers with 4 Maxim guns fight off 5,000 Ndebele warriors. November 18, 1883 The railroads in the US and Canada replace thousands of local solar time scheduling with 4 time zones. The 4 time zones would be made official in the US in 1918. Before this each town would have its own time zone based on when the sun reached its zenith, often displayed by a time ball dropped from a high tower. 1895 Wilhelm Röntgen accidentally discovers X-rays. Within a year, X-rays are being used in the medical field to set bones and peer into the body. For his research, Wilhelm is awarded the first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901. 1898 August 13 Newspaper reports of alleged atrocities by the Spaniards against Cubans fan the flames for the U.S. to intervene to free the Cubans from their Spanish colonial overlords. The USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor, and the U.S. government blames Spain. This fuels the fire in America, and the Spanish-American War starts. Later results show Spain was blameless and the explosion was probably caused by a coal dust explosion. Ironically, after the war to stop abusive colonial powers and free peoples, the U.S. is in possession of its own colonies of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. 1898, February 4 The Philippine-American War starts when Filipino rebels who had been promised independence from U.S. staff realized the U.S. would not grant independence, but would become the new colonial rulers instead of Spain on orders of President McKinley. 4,200 Americans will be killed, and 200,000 Filipinos will die from combat, disease and starvation. 1899 to 1902 In the Boer War, the British take over southern Africa from the Boers, descendants of the Dutch and German settlers. The technology foreshadows World War I machine guns and barbed wire. To prevent the locals from supporting the Boer fighters, the British burn the Boer farms and put their women and children into concentration camps where 30,000 die from malnutrition and disease. 1901 Guglielmo Marconi sends the first wireless transatlantic radio signal from England to Newfoundland. 1902 Willis Carrier installs air conditioning at a printing plant to remove the humidity that was smearing the ink. Willis invents modern air conditioning, and the South will never be the same. 1903 December 17 Near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina Orville and Wilbur Wright fly 37 meters in the first heavier-than-air aircraft. The flight lasts only 12 seconds. 1904 British scientist J. Thomson proposes the plum pudding model of the atom. It states each atom is like a positively charged fluid, the pudding with electrons, the bits of plum scattered throughout. 1905, May 27 to 28 The Battle of Tsushima. The Japanese fleet destroys 2/3 of the Russian Navy in a complete rout. The Russians lose 4,000 sailors compared to only 100 dead for the Japanese. The victory of an Asian power over a Western power stuns Europe. Japan has arrived as a modern power. 1905. While working as a patent clerk, Albert Einstein publishes his theory of relativity and also states energy equals matter, E equals mc2. In his Annus Mirabilis he publishes 4 vastly different papers. 3 of them are Nobel Prize-winning material in their own right. He discovers 3 different ways to calculate Avogadro's number. 1906. HMS Dreadnought starts a new era in warships. It was unique in the following ways: more armor, 11-inch plate, larger than predecessors, 18,000 tons, uses a steam turbine engine for more power, has only large 12-inch caliber guns. The Dreadnought battleship makes all other ships immediately obsolete, and starts a very expensive arms race. 1907. January 26. The Tillman Act of 1907 becomes law, stating that it shall be unlawful for any national bank or any corporation organized by authority of any laws of Congress to make a money contribution in connection with any election to any political office. 1908. September 17. Belty. Thomas Selfridge crashes the Wright Flyer, becoming the first fatal airplane crash victim in history. 1908. September 26. Unknown to his employers, John Lyell is the first person to add chlorine to a public water supply, saving thousands of people from typhoid fever and a host of other diseases in Jersey City. For his hard work, diligence, and foresight, he is sued. 1909. Norman Angell publishes The Great Illusion, putting to rest fears in England of German aggression by reasoning that a future war does not make any sense with the economies of the world are so tightly linked. 1911. New Zealand-born physicist Ernest Rutherford proposes the planetary model of the atom. It states the atom is mostly empty space with a tiny center of positively charged particles surrounded by orbiting negatively charged electrons. 1911. The first ammonia plant to fixate nitrogen from the air using the Haber-Bosch method is built at Ludwigshafen, Aargau, Germany. The process saved many lives by producing cheap fertilizer to feed the world. It will destroy many lives in WWI by creating the nitrogen needed for the German artillery shells. 1911. Instead of each state's legislature selecting them, United States senators are now to be elected by popular vote. 1911. December 3. Willis Carrier presents a paper outlining the 4 principles of modern air conditioning, making the American South habitable for millions of people. 1912. January 6. The German meteorologist Alfred Wegener proposes that all the Earth's continents were previously joined together in a single continent he called Pangaea. Geologists criticize and ridicule him for his theory of continental drift, since he was not a geologist. He dies in 1931 without seeing the universal acceptance of this work. In Europe his ideas were accepted earlier, but in the US it took until the 1960s. 1912. April 15. The unsinkable Titanic goes down with over 1,500 souls. Before the voyage, a steward from the White Star Line is reported to have said, "Not even God himself can sink this ship." Hubris is what the Greeks called it. 1913. Danish physicist Niels Bohr proposes the energy level model of the atom. It states that the electrons orbit the nucleus in specific orbits, or shells, with fixed radii. Electrons absorb or emit radiation when jumping instantly between orbits. 1913. October 7. Henry Ford's entire Highland Park car factory switches to a continuously moving assembly line. This innovation, borrowed from the meat packing industry, shortens the man-hours to make a Model T from 12 hours to 6. The car will now be affordable to ordinary Americans and change manufacturing forever. 1914. June 28. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie are celebrating their 14th wedding anniversary in Sarajevo when their driver takes a wrong turn and the car stalls. By pure chance, Gavrilo Princip, who missed an opportunity earlier in the day to assassinate the pair, is just 2 yards away. Gavrilo shoots and kills Ferdinand and Sophie. This random act will set in motion the horrors of World War I and World War II, killing millions and destroying Europe. 1914. August 3, Germany declares war on France, starting the war to end all wars. 1914, August 15, the U.S. ship Ancon becomes the first ship to pass through the newly opened Panama Canal. During the construction on the canal, 25,000 workers died. 1914, August 26, in the Battle of Lacatio, the German forces using protected howitzers dug in far behind the front lines, firing shells and high arcs, defeat the Allies that were using exposed low arc trajectory artillery. This marks the ascendancy of howitzers over line-of-sight artillery. 1914, September 5, the German U-boat U-21 sinks the HMS Pathfinder, becoming the first submarine to sink a ship by torpedo. 1914, October 31, 60,000 Japanese and 1,500 British successfully attack the German-held port of Tsingtao. For their help in World War I, Japan keeps all the German territory in the Pacific north of the equator, including the Marshalls, Marianas and Carolines. Japan also holds on to German territory in China. These territories provide Japan a launching pad for World War II. 1915, April 22, the first use of modern chemical weapons. German forces open canisters of chlorine gas to float across the battlefield near France. The gas kills everything in its path: people, birds, insects, everything dies, including 1,100 French soldiers. The surviving French colonial troops flee, leaving a 5-mile gap in the lines, but the German forces are also scared of the gas, so they do not take advantage of the opening. More. 1915, September 6, the first military tank rolls off the assembly line in England to break the stalemate of trench warfare in WWI. Although the first tank, Little Willie, is woefully underpowered, it is a sign of things to come. 1915, July 28, 300 U.S. Marines land in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, beginning a controversial 19-year, sometimes brutal, occupation of the nation. 1916, April, Ernest Shackleton, Frank Worsley, and 4 others begin a treacherous 800-mile ocean crossing from Antarctica to South Georgia Island in what will be, according to many, the greatest sailing journey of all time. Their original ship, the Endurance, was crushed in the ice, so 6 of the men set sail in one of the lifeboats, the James Caird, to get help for the others trapped back in Antarctica. 1916, Einstein publishes his general relativity paper. 1916, May 31, the Battle of Jutland. The first and last great battle of the Dreadnought-class ships. 250 ships and 100,000 men fight for 36 hours, but battle was inconclusive. Britain and Germany had spent untold fortunes to build and man these ships. Air power would soon make these ships largely obsolete. 1916, the First Battle of the Somme begins. It lasts 5 months and the death toll of over 1 million is for the sake of an Allied control of 125 square miles. 1916, March 22, the German U-boat U-68 is the first submarine sunk by the Royal Navy's newly developed depth charge. 1916, September 15, in the trenches near Somme-Ypres, German soldiers are the first to glimpse steel monsters crawling slowly towards them from no man's land. These terrifying British tanks are impervious to machine guns. They don't know it on that day, but warfare is changed forever. 1916, November 21, HMHS Britannic, the sister ship to the Titanic, strikes a mine or perhaps is hit by a torpedo, and becomes the largest ship to be lost in WWI. Oddly enough, one person, Violet Jessop, survives both disasters. 1917, April 6, the United States enters World War I against Germany. The tide of the war is already against the Germans. 10 million people will die from the war. 1917, November 2, George Hale, a brilliant yet often troubled astronomer, sees his vision completed when the world's largest telescope sees first light at the Mount Wilson Observatory. Edwin Hubble will use Hale's 100-inch telescope to show the universe is filled with vast numbers of receding galaxies. 1917, December 17, the first true aircraft carrier, the British HMS Argus, is launched. 1918 November 11, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I is officially over. The treaty was signed at 5 a.m. with hostilities to cease at 11 a.m. During those 6 hours, 2,738 soldiers died. 320 of those were American. American commanders who knew the war was to be over in hours still sent soldiers into battle to punish the Germans. 1918 The influenza virus kills over 50 million people. About a quarter of the U.S. population catches it, and 2 to 3% die from it. 1919 October 28 Prohibition starts in the U.S. after Congress passes, over Wilson's veto, the Volstead Act making alcohol illegal. After failing to stem the consumption of alcohol, and spurring the growth of organized crime, it will be repealed in the 23rd Amendment in 1933. 1920, January 16 The 18th Amendment brings prohibition to America with many unexpected results, like the rise of organized crime. Prohibition will last until 1933 and the passage of the 21st Amendment. 1920 British astrophysicist Arthur Eddington proposes that stars make their energy from the fusion of hydrogen into helium. Before this, some thought the sun was a giant ball of coal. 1920 August 25 In the Battle of Warsaw, the Polish forces surprisingly defeat the Red Army at the outskirts of Warsaw, stopping Lenin's plan of exporting the communist revolution through Europe after World War I. 1923 De Broglie proposes the matter wave theory. 1923 Heisenberg states his uncertainty principle that we cannot know pairs of measurements exactly, like the exact position and exact momentum of an electron. 1926 Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger proposes the quantum mechanical model of the atom. It states that the electrons do not travel in exact orbits, but rather as clouds of probabilities. 1927, September 7 Philo T. Farnsworth transmits the first television image and gives birth to a new industry. Later, he was so disappointed with the content, he forbade his family to watch TV. 1928 First Soviet Five-Year Plan. 5 million Ukrainian peasants are deliberately starved to death. Visiting journalists ignore famine and praise Stalin's success. 1928 September 15 Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming notices penicillin mold killing a Staphylococcus culture. The revolution of antibiotics starts. 1929 October 29 The New York Stock Exchange crashes in what will become known as Black Friday. This will precede a global depression made worse by a drop in global trade started by the 1930 Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. 1930 February 18 In the late 19th century, astronomers postulated the existence of a ninth planet based on irregularities in the orbit of Uranus. Clyde Tombaugh finally finds the expected planet to be named Pluto. Oddly enough, Pluto is far too small to affect the orbit of Uranus. Pluto is officially declassified as a planet in 2006, much to the dismay of many. 1932 Sir James Chadwick discovers the neutron. 1932 to 1933 The Holodomor. After wrecking the Ukrainian agriculture by collectivizing the farms, Stalin sends people to take all the grain in the Ukraine from the farmers and send it to Russia. 3.9 million Ukrainians die in the man-made famine. 1932, June 17 To protect American industry and farmers from foreign competition, Congress passes the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raising tariffs. 1,000 economists petitioned Hoover not to sign the bill, arguing that the tariff will only make the economy worse, but they are ignored. After other countries retaliate with their own tariffs, international trade grinds to a halt and the global depression becomes even worse. 1933 Ernst Ruska creates the first electron microscope in Germany. His invention was fundamental to the progression of science, and scientists could now peer deeper into living cells. April 5, 1933 President Franklin D. Roosevelt issues Executive Order 6102 forbidding U.S. citizens from owning more than 5 ounces of gold coin. Citizens were forced under threat of 10-year prison sentence to sell their non-collector gold coins to the government for $20.67 an ounce. After collecting all the gold coins, the price of gold was then raised to $35 an ounce. The prohibition against owning gold coin was finally lifted in 1974. 1936 The first semi-automatic rifle issued to infantry, the M1 Garand, is invented. It had a clip with 8 cartridges allowing rapid fire and was so superior to the bolt-action M1903, Patton called it, the greatest implement of battle ever devised. The M1 gave U.S. troops in World War II tremendous advantage over the single-shot rifles in the Asian theater. 1937, May 6, the German airship Hindenburg explodes in New Jersey. Amazingly, 61 of the 97 persons aboard survive. The designers originally wanted to use helium instead of the flammable hydrogen, but the United States, the major producer of helium, had a helium boycott of Germany. 1938 June 4, Chiang Kai-shek orders Commander Chiang Shinya to open the levees of the Yellow River and flood the countryside to prevent a Japanese invasion. The floods slowed down the Japanese but did not stop them. 1 million Chinese died from the resulting floods, and resentment to the nationalist government over the flooding drove more people into the communist camp. 1938 November 10, Kristallnacht, a night of terror visited upon the Jews of Germany by the Nazis. Hundreds of Jews are killed, and the glass from synagogues and businesses are shattered onto the streets. 1939 September 1, Germany invades Poland, starting World War II. Before the war ends, 70 million people will die, with 2/3 being civilians. 1 in 10 Germans will die, with 90% of those dying on the Eastern Front with Russia. 15 million Chinese and 27 million Soviets will perish. On average, nearly 30,000 people will die daily during this war, the most deadly conflict in our history to date. 1939 September 3, mistaking her for a warship, German submarine U-30 sinks the civilian ship Agena, starting the longest, largest, and most complex naval battle in history, the Battle for the Atlantic. 1939, November 30, the Soviet Union invades Finland and starts the Russo-Finnish War. The Soviets do so poorly against such a weaker opponent that Hitler is confirmed in his belief that the Russians are inferior soldiers, and the purge of the Red Army has weakened it. The Soviets do eventually win the Russo-Finnish War on March 12, 1940. 1940 Alan Turing, with help from Polish sources and Cambridge mathematician W. G. Welchman, breaks the German Enigma code, saving countless Allied lives. 1940 September 7, 300 German bombers drop 337 tons of bombs on London, starting 57 consecutive days of bombing known as the Blitz. 1940 November 11, using 21 obsolete ferry Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious, the British launched the first all-aircraft ship-to-ship naval attack in history against the Italians in the Battle of Taranto. The reign of the battleship is over. The carrier will become the main focus of navies around the world. The Japanese observers of the battle are taking notes. 1941 June 22, Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of Russia is launched 129 years to the day after Napoleon crossed the Niemen into Russia. Stalin did not believe the numerous intelligence reports detailing the German buildup. 1941 December 2, the relentless German advance in Russia is finally stopped at the doorstep of Moscow. The Germans suffer from ever-lengthening supply lines, the dreadful weather, and the Russians are finally able to mobilizing troops from the east just in time to stop the Third Reich from taking Moscow. 1941 December 7, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Just before dawn, 270 miles northwest of Oahu, Hawaii, 181 Japanese fighters and bombers fly from 6 aircraft carriers to launch a surprise attack on the U.S. military bases in Hawaii, sinking 4 battleships and killing 2,401 Americans. The main targets of the attack, the American carriers, are not in Hawaii. 1941 December 8, due to bad weather, the Japanese could not attack the Philippines simultaneously with Pearl Harbor as they had planned, so 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, The Japanese Air Force attacks American Air Force Base Clark Field in the Philippines. Despite having warning, MacArthur mounts no defense, and most of his planes are destroyed on the ground. 1941 December 8 to 23 Battle of Wake Island. The American defenders of the tiny island fight against overwhelming odds and hold the island, providing the first victory for the U.S. in the Pacific against the Japanese. U.S. reinforcements are sent from Hawaii, but later in a very controversial decision, they are recalled. The Wake Island defenders push back advancing Japanese soldiers, but the American officers surrender the island on December 23, in another controversial decision. 1941 December 10 The battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse are sunk by Japanese aircraft near Singapore, bringing an end to the age of battleships ruling the seas. Admiral Sir Tom Phillips had declined air support, thinking his ships were not in danger and knowing that no battleship had been sunk solely by air power in the open sea. After this, everyone realized that battleships without air cover were doomed. 1941 December 11 In a decision that puzzled his staff, Hitler, without consulting that staff, declares war on the United States. Winston Churchill sleeps well that night. 1942, March Germans cryptographers secretly break the Allied naval cipher 3 and read the Allied communications. This dramatically increases the sinking of Allied merchant ships. After code breakers from Bletchley Park tell the Admiralty that their code is mostly likely broken, the military waits 10 months to change the codes. 1942, December 2 at the University of Chicago, Enrico Fermi and friends generate the first self-sustained nuclear reaction. 1942, February 23 a Japanese submarine shells an oil refinery near Santa Barbara, California. 1942, May 4 to 8 the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Allies with 27 ships square off against 53 ships from the Imperial Japanese Navy, Asian north of Australia. It's the first battle where the ships fighting each other never saw their opponent. Their airplanes did all the damage. The Japanese technically win the battle, but the Japanese invasion plans for Port Moresby, New Guinea are thwarted. More. 1942, June 4 to 7 the Battle of Midway. The Americans had knowledge of the attack on Midway by decoding the Japanese communications. Even so, the battle is confused and turns on the luck of a U.S. squadron discovering the exact location of the enemy fleet. Japan loses 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soria and Hyria, and 200 highly trained pilots. The U.S. loses the USS Yorktown carrier. This is a turning point in the Pacific War and cements the role of the aircraft carrier as the dominant naval vessel. 1942 August 7-1943, February 9 the Battle of Guadalcanal. The U.S. Marines invade Guadalcanal Island to capture an airbase in the southern Solomon Islands. 1943 July 12, the Battle of Kursk. The largest tank engagement yet is fought between the Germans and the Russians. The German commander had wanted to attack months ago, but Hitler refused and wanted to wait until his new super tank could be deployed there, giving the Russians ample time to dig trenches, mine the approaches, place artillery, and prepare the battleground to their liking. 1943, July 27, the firebombing of Hamburg. Hamburg, Germany endures the first firestorm where 739 aircraft participate and drop incendiary bombs, causing an unprecedented fire so large it resembled a tornado with winds of 150 miles per hour and temperatures of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt streets spontaneously burst into flames and many people huddled in underground bunkers died as all the oxygen is consumed in the fires above. 42,600 people were killed, about half that of the direct casualties of the Hiroshima bombing. 1943, August 29 the first remote-controlled missile, the German Is-293, hits the sloop HMS Bideford. The missile is dropped from a bomber and an operator in the bomber uses a joystick to guide it. The same controller is used in the Fritz X. 1943, August 29 the first remote-controlled bomb, the German Fritz X weapon is used in the Mediterranean to attack ships. The Fritz X had a radio receiver and control vanes that could be controlled remotely. 1943, September 9, the battleship Roma is attacked by two German Fritz X bombs, becoming the first vessel sunk by a guided weapon. 1944, May 22, the Allies launch a major bombing attack on the synthetic oil plants in Germany, which supplied all its aviation fuel and 3/4 of its diesel, dooming the Third Reich war machine. In the future, Germany will have tanks poised to strike in the Battle of the Bulge, but unable to continue due to not having any fuel. The Germans have to destroy their own tanks and retreat. 1944, June 6, the invasion of Normandy. The largest amphibious landing in history to date starts. This accelerates the end of the Third Reich by opening a Western front that the Germans will have to fight in addition to the Eastern Front with the Russians. 1944, June 19 to 20th, Battle of the Philippine Sea. The U.S. attacks Saipan and the Marianas Islands to use as an airbase for the B-29 superfortresses to bomb the Japanese main islands. Japanese Admiral Ozawa Jizaburo, known as the ugliest sailor in the Navy, sends 430 planes to destroy the U.S. forces in what will be the largest carrier battle of the war. The U.S. has complete victory and its fighters shoot down over 400 Japanese airplanes in what is known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese lose 3 carriers. More. 1944, July 28, the first rocket-powered airplane, the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, enters military service. The stubby-winged plane made from plywood is the fastest plane to date with a top speed of 700 miles per hour. The plane is a technological marvel, but due to its short flight time of 7 minutes, highly unstable fuel, and too large of a speed differential with its bomber targets, it is a military failure. 1944, October 23 to 26, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The largest naval battle in history is fought off the coast of the Philippines. The Japanese Navy is destroyed as an effective fighting force by the US and Australians. Organized kamikaze attacks are used for the first time. More. 1945, February 6, HMS Venturer sinks German U-864 off Norway, becoming the only submerged submarine on record to sink another submerged submarine. 1945, February 19, March 26, the Battle of Iwo Jima. The U.S. wants the island to serve as a landing strip since it is almost halfway between Japan and Saipan, for short-range fighter escorts and for damaged B-29 bombers that could not make it back to Saipan. 7,000 Americans and 20,000 Japanese soldiers will die in the battle. 1945, March 9 to 10, the firebombing of Tokyo. An armada of 334 B-29 bombers from bases in the Mariana Islands drop 1,665 tons of napalm and magnesium incendiary bombs over Tokyo, resulting in over 100,000 deaths and 1 million homeless. This was the deadliest 24-hour period in modern history. More. 1945, April 1st, invasion of Okinawa. The U.S. invades Okinawa with the largest naval force ever assembled: 44 aircraft carriers, 20 battleships, 38 cruisers, and 146 destroyers. Hundreds of kamikaze pilots attack the U.S. ships in waves, causing extensive damage and casualties. 1 out of 7 U.S. Navy officers who die in the Pacific Theater die at Okinawa. 1945, May 8, Bay Day, victory in Europe. Germany unconditionally surrenders. 1945, July 16, 5:29 and 21 seconds MWT, the Earth witnesses the first nuclear explosion as the Manhattan Project comes to fruition in the Trinity test of a plutonium bomb. 1945, August 6, at 8:16, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, drops an atomic bomb containing 60 kilograms of uranium-235 on Hiroshima, Japan, killing an estimated 80,000 civilians outright and perhaps over 200,000 total over the next weeks. More. 1945, August 9, the B-29 named Boxcar drops Fat Mantha nuclear bomb containing 8 kilograms of plutonium-239 on Nagasaki, Japan. 1945, August 14, VJ Day, Japan surrenders 8 days after the second atom bomb is dropped. His subjects hear Emperor Hirohito's voice the next day for the first time as he announces the surrender on the radio. The estimated cost of WW2 in human lives is 35 to 60 million, two-thirds of them civilians, and a price tag of $1 trillion. 1946 Jack T. Mullen builds a tape recorder based on the German magnetophone he saw in studio of Radio Frankfurt in Bad Nauheim after the war. Bing Crosby uses it to tape delay his show. Radio was never the same. 1947 August 14, the sun sets on the British Empire. Outgoing British Viceroy Lord Mountbatten and Nehru meet for the handover ceremony to make India free of British rule. Mountbatten makes a toast to India, and Nehru makes a toast to King George VI, then the world's largest democracy is born. 1947, November 29, the United Nations UN General Assembly passes Resolution 181 calling for the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. 1948, May 14, as the British mandate over Palestine is about to expire, David Ben-Gurion and the Jewish People's Council announce the new state of Israel. 1949, half of all the gold mined in history, 22,000 tons, is in the United States due in part to the U.S. selling weapons and supplies during World War II. 1949, July 27, the Comet, the world's first jet-powered airliner, takes flight, revolutionizing the airline industry. Unfortunately, the Comet was short-lived as it suffered several fatal crashes due to the unknown effects of metal fatigue. 1950, June 25, North Korean soldiers invade South Korea, starting the Korean War. Fighting will end on July 27, 1953 without a formal peace treaty, so the nations are technically still at war. 3 million people die in the war, mostly civilians. The final border is approximately where it started before the war. 1952, November 1, the world's first thermonuclear bomb is detonated on Antarctic Atoll, bringing the fire of the sun to our planet. 1953, March 26, Jonas Salk announces the successful creation of a polio vaccine. The year before, 58,000 people contracted the disease, and 3,000 died from it. Before this, mothers everywhere dreaded the start of summer as polio season, and tried to protect their children from the relentless killer. 1953, May 29, humans finally conquer the highest point on Earth. Edmund Hillary of New Zealand and Tenzing Norgay, a Nepalese Sherpa, reached the summit of Everest. News of this once-in-a-species event reached England on the day of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. 1954, January 21, the first nuclear-powered submarine, Nautilus, is launched. 1954, May 6, runner Roger Bannister becomes the first person to break the 4-minute mile. 1954, May 7, the French fort at Dien Bien Phu is taken by the Vietnamese forces. In a heroic and unexpected move, the Viet Minh disassemble artillery pieces. Men, women, and children carry them up the rugged mountains around Dien Bien Phu. Once reassembled, the artillery shell the base into submission. This victory accelerates decolonization. 1955, Malcolm P. McLean, a trucking entrepreneur from North Carolina, conceived of the idea of using an 8x8x20 steel container to move goods across land and sea, thus creating the container that revolutionized world trade. Containers reduce the loading and unloading of boats from weeks to days. 1957, the first man-made satellite, Sputnik I, is launched by Russia. 1957, October 7, the British nuclear reactor at Windscale used to create plutonium suffers a serious accident with 11 tons of uranium on fire. Windscale is Britain's worst nuclear disaster to date. 1957, the first major computer language, Fortran, is invented by John Backus and his team at IBM. 1958, September 12, the first integrated circuit chip is demonstrated by Jack Kilby of Texas Instruments. It replaces hand-soldered transistors and ushers in the age of modern computing. 1958, John McCarthy designs Lisp, a versatile computer language whose descendants are still widely used today. 1958 Chairman Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward collectivizes Chinese agriculture and creates a command economy, resulting in the deaths of 45 million people during the famine that follows. 1959 December The world's first nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, the USS SBN George Washington, takes to the ocean. 1960 January 23 Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh travel to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the lowest point on Earth in the Bathyscaphe Triste. Oddly, no one has ever gone back a second time. 1961 January 3 An experimental nuclear power plant in Idaho, the SL-1, goes prompt critical during maintenance and kills 3 Army specialists. The reactor is buried on site. 1962, October 22 In retaliation for American nuclear missiles in Turkey, the Soviet Union sends nuclear missiles to Cuba, starting the Cuban Missile Crisis. On this date, President Kennedy orders an embargo around Cuba to prevent more missiles coming to the island. The world comes close to a nuclear war. Khrushchev and Kennedy come to an agreement. The Soviet missiles are withdrawn from Cuba, and the U.S. missiles return home from Turkey. 1961, January 17 President Eisenhower gives his farewell speech warning Americans against the rising military-industrial complex that would grow beyond the country's needs. He also encouraged diplomacy and restraint in working with the Soviet Union. 1961, August 12 Communist East Germany starts erecting barbed wire fences and later concrete walls in what will become a symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall. 1961, April 11 Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human in space and to orbit the Earth. 1963 Norman Borlaug, the most underappreciated humanitarian of our age, launches the Green Revolution by breeding strains of wheat that yield 3 to 5 times than ordinary wheat in Mexico. Borlaug saves millions of lives in India, which after much bureaucratic red tape, finally allows the grain to be grown locally. 1964 Quarks are proposed to be the basic building blocks of protons and neutrons. 1964 While trying to clean up the noise on an antenna, Arno Penzias and Robert Woodrow Wilson unknowingly find the cosmic background radiation predicted by astrophysicists. For finding this evidence supporting the Big Bang Theory, they received the Nobel Prize in 1978. 1966, January 17, the US B-52 bomber loaded with 4 nuclear weapons taking part in Operation Chrome Dome crashes after colliding with its refueling tanker near Palomar, Spain. 3 of the 4 weapons are recovered quickly and the 4th falls into the Mediterranean and is recovered later as the most expensive, intensive, harrowing and feverish underwater search for a man-made object in world history. Some plutonium is scattered around the area and cleaned up by the U.S. government. 1967, June 11 The unbrokered ceasefire ends the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War. Israel doubles in size and gains all of Jerusalem. 1966 NASA receives its highest budget ever, 4.5% of the total U.S. federal budget. 1967. October 21, 100,000 Americans protest against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C. Although polls show less than half the population support the war, it will continue for another 7 years. 1968, March 16, 504 Vietnamese are killed in the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. The incident is covered up by the Army and only revealed later by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh. 1969, July 20 Neil Armstrong becomes the first man to walk on the moon. 1969 The first 4 nodes of the ARPANET are connected, becoming the forerunner of the Internet. 1969 The Chemical Bank of Rockville Centre, New York, presents the world with the first ATM machine. 1971, August 15 After years of inflation, caused in part by not offsetting the cost of the Vietnam War by either raising taxes or cutting other government programs, President Nixon takes the US dollar off the gold standard, making the dollar a fiat currency. 1973 October 6 The coalition of Arab armies led by Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. Although Egypt makes early gains in the Sinai and Syria pushes deep into the Golan Heights, the Israel Defense Force eventually stops the advance and pushes the invading armies back. 1973 Gary Kildall writes the CP/M operating system for his home computer so he doesn't have to drive to work to program the mainframe. 1973, January 22, the Supreme Court legalizes abortion in the Roe v. Wade case. 1975 April 30, after 11 years 58,220 American dead, and 2 million Vietnamese killed, the Vietnam War finally ends. October 20, 1975 the Russian probe Venera 9 becomes the first human-made object to land on another planet when it descends to the surface of Venus, and takes pictures for 53 minutes with one of its two cameras. The second camera's lens cap did not release. Its success is all the more impressive since the surface temperature of the planet is 864 degrees Fahrenheit. 1977, March 27, the deadliest aircraft accident in history takes place in Canary Islands when 583 people are killed in the collision of two airplanes on the runway. Investigations revealed many causes including a too great of an experience gradient, where younger crew members were discouraged from questioning the judgments of more experienced crew members. 1980 May 8 Target Zero Day. After terrorizing humanity for 12,000 years and killing 500 million people in just the last century, smallpox is officially declared eradicated. 1990 Sir Tim Berners-Lee creates the first web browser at CERN using the Internet technology as the backbone and HTML as the presentation layer. 1982, March 19, Argentine scrap metal merchants raise their flag over the island of South Georgia in the opening scene of what will become the Falklands War with Great Britain. The British government instructed its soldiers not to resist beyond the point where lives might be lost to no avail. 1984 Largest bioterrorist attack in the United States modern history occurs in the Dalles, Oregon. 751 people become ill with the Salmonella bacteria spread by followers of Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh in places like salad bars. They were trying to prevent enough people from voting that the Bhagwan's followers could take over the local government. 1986, April 26, 1:24 a.m. After turning off safety system after safety system to run tests, the inadequately trained night staff of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor hear their first explosions as the plant becomes the site of history's largest nuclear plant accident. 1979, March 28 at 4 a.m. a valve fails to close at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, allowing cooling water to drain from the reactor. Operators, being confused from gauge readings, override the automatic cooling system and the reactor comes within an hour of a total catastrophic meltdown. 1989, November 9, East and West Germans tear down the Berlin Wall and pave the way for the uniting of Germany a year later. The Cold War ends and the Soviet Union will be dissolved. 1990, April 24, the Hubble telescope is launched into orbit around the Earth and takes astronomy to a whole new level. 1991, January 16, President George Herbert Walker Bush with allies launches the first Iraqi war with Operation Desert Storm to push the Iraqi army out of the tiny kingdom of Kuwait. 1992, April 14, the last of 36 hexagonal mirrors is placed in the Keck telescope, realizing Jerry Nelson's design of a new type of telescope composed of multiple mirrors with computer-controlled actuators to correction for atmospheric distortions. The Keck has 4 times the resolution of the Hale telescope. 1994 in Rwanda, ethnic Hutu extremists massacre 800,000 Tutsis in a few weeks using machetes and clubs. 1994, April 27, Nelson Mandela wins South Africa's first multiracial election. Apartheid is dead. 1995, June, Nick Steinsberger, while working for Mitchell Energy at the S.H. Griffin No. 4 well near Ft. Worth, Texas, gambles on a new well drilling technique called slick water fracturing and starts the fracking boom in America and changes global politics and the American economy. 1997, May 11, IBM's Deep Blue chess playing program beats a world champion, Garry Kasparov, for the first time. 1997, February 22 for the first time a mammal, a sheep named Dolly is cloned by a team near Edinburgh, Scotland. 2001, September 11, 19 Al-Qaeda militants hijack 4 commercial airplanes. 2 of the planes fly into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, the third plane crashes into the Pentagon. On the 4th plane, the passengers learn of the other planes crashing into the Twin Towers. With the words, "Let's roll," the passengers attack the hijackers to prevent more Americans from dying. Their plane crashes in a field in Pennsylvania. The final toll was 2,996 people killed. 2001, October 7, under the direction of President George Bush, U.S. forces invade Afghanistan to deny Al-Qaeda a base of operations, starting the longest war in American history. 2003, March 19, under the direction of President George W. Bush, U.S. and British forces invade Iraq to rid the country of its non-existent weapons of mass destruction. The death toll of the war and the instability that follows is estimated to cost 1 million, mostly Iraqi, lives. 2005, August 29, Hurricane Katrina slams into the Gulf Coast and becomes the worst natural disaster in the U.S. to date. The government will be heavily criticized for its slow response to aid citizens. 2010, December 17, after suffering for years under governmental corruption and abuse, Tarek El-Tayeb Mohammed Bouazizi unknowingly launches the Arab Spring revolutions throughout the Middle East by setting himself on fire in response to continued police harassment and demands for bribes. 2011, December 15, after almost 9 years, 4,500 American dead, 32,000 American wounded, over 1 million Iraqi dead, and a cost of $4 trillion, the U.S. wins down the war in Iraq. 2012, July 4, scientists from the Large Hadron Collider announced the discovery of the Higgs particle at a mass of about 125 GeV, further completing the Standard Model. 2014, December 14, the Chinese rover U2 Jade Rabbit lands on the surface of the Moon to start its 31-month mission. 2014, December 5, Wu et al. Used the CRISPR-Cas9 genetic editing technique to correct a genetic defect in mice. 2017, Google's AI program AlphaZero teaches itself how to play chess. Unlike all the other chess programs before it, which were given guidelines by humans on how to play, AlphaZero is the first to teach itself by playing games against itself. After 2 hours of running, it is better than human players. After 4 hours, it beat the best chess programs in the world. 2019, January 3, the Chinese Chang'e-4 probe lands on the far side of the Moon. 2020, February, people stay home from work, global stock markets crash, and economies go into reverse as the coronavirus COVID-19 strikes the world. 2021, August 30, after 20 years, 2,326 U.S. military deaths, over 20,000 American wounded, 47,000 civilian Afghan deaths, and $2 trillion. The U.S.-led war in Afghanistan winds down as the final C-17 leaves Kabul airport a minute before midnight. 2022, February 24, Russian tanks roll into Ukraine, starting the Russo-Ukrainian War. 2022, October 28, for the first time in history, unmanned aerial vehicles and unmanned surface vessels attacked a naval force in a combined attack when Ukraine attacked Russian vessels in Sevastopol. Geologic timeline: History of the world BC, History of the world ed. Presidents of the United States, Bible history timeline, Random Dots on history. Home. MISC. Coin stacking. Knowledge base. Quotes. Family news. Genealogy. Utilities. History. Blogs. Mind periodic. About. Sarah site. Search this site. Go to home page. Kindly report errors, typos, or misspellings.